Empirically, right, the origin of the field has just tended to be dominated by books on Anglo-American grand strategy. So the grand strategy of the United Kingdom, the grand strategy of the United States, strategies of containment, right? And so by sort of extension, then it's often focused on the experience of Western democratic great powers who project their power externally and throughout the international system. That's not always explicit, right? They don't always say that, but by virtue of the sort of nature of the role of these actors in the international system, this is often single case studies of grand strategy, and so it just tends to be very heavily focused on the UK, on the US, and on the external security and military policies of great powers. Partly as just simply as a result of the cases that scholars have chosen to write about as examples of grand strategy. There are exceptions, Japan, the Soviet Union, some of this, but overall the sort of external focus is still pretty clear empirically. And when internal factors are considered, they're much more often treated as a constraint or an enabler. So they're a means. They're a factor that affects means, and they affect the state's ability to achieve ends that are still fundamentally external in orientation and emphasis, right? And that just doesn't work very well for China. And I'm not saying anything that Professor Fravel and other scholars of China's history and strategy haven't noted before, but China just fundamentally differs from a lot of our prototypical cases of grand strategy in being, non-Western, non-democratic. So it's a socialist non-democracy with a Leninist party state system. It's a relatively late modernizer, which affects all sorts of parts of how the economy and as well as the coercive forces work, military and internal. It's a revolutionary autocracy with a post-colonial element to its history as well, and a history of civil conflict in terms of its sort of the regime emergence, which means that there have always been really heavy demands on internal security from the time of the origin of the PRC. And until 2015, it actually didn't have a written national security strategy document. There was no national, so the United States since the 1940s, late 1940s, has had a written national security strategy. China did not have one until 2015. And so we had to look elsewhere, like the military guidelines, for hints as to what China's military strategy was. But in terms of national security or grand strategy, there was not a codified one single document that we could look to try to understand how China approached that broader harnessing of national power to achieve certain goals. Right, so if you go back to some of the sort of basic or fundamental precepts about what grand strategy is, right? The sort of most common definition that you'll get is that it's a theory about how a state can cause security for itself, right? And I've given you a couple of different examples of people who have used that framework. Usually that means you have to identify threats, you have to figure out what approach will address that, and then you actually have to translate that into some sort of behavior. But note here that there's actually nothing really in here that requires that the thinking about security be internal or external at all, right? It's not actually specified. And we know from studies of comparative authoritarianism, which is where I did a lot of the work for my first book, that authoritarian regimes tend to think much more about security in internal terms than they do just about, it's not that they don't think about external defense and military security, but they spend a lot more time thinking about domestic challenges, the risk of a coup, managing the risk of popular unrest. And so there's a lot more emphasis on internal security. And so really, if that should at some point show up in grand strategic thinking, right? At least that's the argument that I'm trying to make in this book. And I think when you look at China's behavior, it's actually very helpful to look at it that way. And so the basic argument that I'm going to walk through today is that Xi Jinping came up with this concept he calls the comprehensive national security concept, and that really is China's theory of how to make itself secure. Now, the actor making and defining that strategy is the CCP. So it's a theory about how to make the CCP secure, not necessarily China writ large, and we can come back to that in a few minutes. But that essentially the comprehensive national security concept is a grand strategy. in the sense that it's a theory of how to make China secure. And the objective of that strategy is regime security. The approach is a sort of preventive approach. And I'll walk through what that means, because I think it has implications that are somewhat different than, for example, Jessica Chen Weiss's work, where she sees the CCP as fundamentally on defense. A preventive logic to your strategy can result in things that look more revisionist and potentially more offensive under specific conditions, because of the use of this preventive logic to achieve these goals. So I wanted to try to be precise about whether or not there has been a change in the strategy, and to lay out some conditions ex ante for how would we know if the strategy is new. And so drawing again on that literature on what grand strategy does, there has to be a change in perception of the threat environment. There has to then be a corresponding change in, okay, based on this new problem, here's how our approach is going to change to solve it, to address the new threat or the change in the threat environment. And you actually have to put that into practice, right? So this can't all be sort of a theoretical construct that exists on paper and doesn't affect behavior. And so the ways that you can see this put into practice have to do with force structure, bureaucratic reorganization, could be legal infrastructure, it could be sort of personnel appointments. You appoint different people because you appoint different types of expertise to deal with new threats. It might show up in budgets and procurement decisions, and then it'll show up in actual policy change. Right? So what I want to do is walk through, I think the bottom line here is that I think that Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept does meet all three of those conditions. So let me go through very briefly why I think that is. Most of us probably know that around April 2014, Xi Jinping premiered this concept that was called the comprehensive national security concept. He announced that in the context of also establishing something called a Central National Security Commission. Now, at the time, Japan was also in the process of establishing an NSC, and a lot of scholars in the United States thought that this was going to be an NSC like ours that would help with crisis management, and maybe it was like Japan's, and really kind of misread, I think, what the Central National Security Commission was going to do. But that was followed about 7 months later by the Politburo, so about 25 of China's top leaders, approving the first national security strategy for China. Right, so right there, there's a change in the policy process, because you have a document that didn't exist. Right, it's not the military guidelines that Professor Fravel has written extensively about. Right, this is a different kind of document that's being approved at a very high level. It is still not public. We have sort of official media reports on it, but nobody has the complete strategy document. And it was described, as a new thing for China. Yes, this could be bureaucrats paying lip service to the boss. So this is such a big change, or such a great. But they're actually, I think they actually are onto something. And hopefully what I walk through in the next couple of slides will explain why. In November of 2021, they did this again, right? So this is not a one-off. The Politburo approved a second version of the national security strategy on kind of a 5-year plan for 2021 to 25. Again, not public. Seems to have some continuity or some consistency with some of the things that were in the first one. But again, it's a little bit hard to know, because unlike the U.S. national security strategy, this appears to be more a document for internal strategy formulation and coordination. It doesn't have the external communication function that like the U.S. NSS does. So Xi Jinping talked about how, and you've probably seen a lot of these things written about in various places, that China was facing the most complicated internal and external threat environment in its history. Not the worst, right? The CCP had the Long March, where they were literally decimated down to 10%-ish of their former strength. They fought an actual war. It's not the hardest, but the most complicated. Right, and that's actually quite a statement for the CCP when you look back at its history. That is marked by increasing threats and challenges, and that internal and external security threats are interlocked and can be mutually activated, which I actually think is really important, and I'll come back to in a moment. There's this phrase, major changes unseen in a century, that Doshi's book in particular focuses a lot on. And originally that phrase kind of got interpreted as like a triumphalist, look, the East is rising, the West is declining, kind of China is approaching the center of the world stage, which is a phrase that appears in a lot of these passages. But when you read it, there's actually a much more there's a darker side to this because it's a dialectical. And the closer China gets to the center of the world stage, the closer it gets to achieving goals, the harder the task becomes and the more risks and threats and dangers there are. So instead of increased power, kind of decreasing risk, increased power and sort of centrality in the international environment actually increases or heightens the threat. So that's the sort of characterization of the threat environment. And I can answer questions about that to make a little more precise what is distinctive about that if people have follow-up questions. But the new approach basically talks about that the center of gravity of national security work is explicitly internal, and a lot of Chinese commentaries draw a contrast between that and the sort of focus on more traditional and external security threats under previous Chinese leaders. Again, some of this is probably, emphasizing what is, new and original and Xi Jinping's contributions. I think there's definitely a little bit of that, but there's a very consistent emphasis on this being different, particularly in the internal and the non-traditional focus on the nature of the security challenges. The foundation is political security, which you're like, okay, what does that mean? So you have to go peel the onion back another layer, go look at political security, and it's defined as securing the authority of the CCP leadership and China's socialist system with Xi Jinping at the core. Right? That's pretty explicitly a regime security concept, right? So the referent is not the nation, it's not the state, it is explicitly the CCP and the system that it heads that is the object to be protected, right? That's the object to be secured. And so you get things like, right, Xinhua talking about what is the red line in US-China relations. This was after the sort of confrontational meeting in Anchorage that some of us probably read about. And the red line that gets articulated, right, in the aftermath of that meeting is the governing status of the CCP, right? That's the fundamental red line that has to be protected and defended. Right. And so again, if you try to put this in terms of ends and means, the center of gravity is internal, the objective is political security or regime security, and the approach is this phrase that Xi Jinping uses a lot in sort of various permutations called prevention and control. And there was a lot of discussion about stability maintenance in the Hu-Wen years, and Xi Jinping has really shifted away from the use of that term, and in some cases his domestic security officials have explicitly criticized it as being too reactive. And prevention and control is a sort of more proactive approach. That's the sort of positive spin on it. And so you see Xi Jinping in the month that the new national security strategy gets approved, saying things to the domestic security apparatus like, the whole country's political legal organs need to take initiative in adapting to the new circumstances, right? Again, new environment, new circumstances, things have changed, we've got to do things differently to address them. Strengthen forward-looking work, prevent and control various risks, and carry out great responsibility for protecting national security and social stability. Okay? So again, very preventive, forward-looking, let's be proactive, because things have changed. Okay? And so under that, you get a bunch of different pieces. One is this phrase that, again, in 2015, the State Council and the CCP Central Committee approved, which is a directive to establish what they call a multidimensional information-based prevention and control system for public and social security. It's really jargony in both, whatever language you use, right? That's sort of a shorthand for the surveillance state and the back-end systems that use the surveillance state to govern, right? You also see phrases like front-end social governance, which is like deal with problems at the front end, not at the back end. The Feng Qiao experience, which is a Maoist sort of almost a parable that Xi Jinping has re-invoked about resolving problems at the local level so they don't escalate either vertically or horizontally within the Chinese political system. And then you see a lot of immunization metaphors. So I was actually struck for the first time, and I want to go back. I didn't get a chance to go back and look at PLA Daily or People's Daily but I will in follow-up if anybody's interested. There was a PLA colonel, I think, who was on TV who used the analogy of a tumor for the first time with respect to Taiwan. And I've seen that on Xinjiang quite a bit. But I actually want to go back and see, because I think that metaphor is new as applied to Taiwan, which is maybe not a great sign, because it suggests that you actually have to preventively intervene to save the larger body politic. And that's the way that logic has been applied to Xinjiang to justify some of what's happened there. There's also a reversal of the security development relationship. So for a long time, you would hear Chinese leaders or see Chinese scholars arguing that if you developed Xinjiang, if you developed Tibet, that the security problem, that was the fundamental solution to the security problems. Xi Jinping now will say things like, security is the precondition for development. Or sometimes you'll see him say, well, there are two wheels on one cart. They have to run in parallel. But the relationship is pretty clearly changed. Howard, who's at RAND, has a really good piece kind of tracing discursive changes in over time under Xi Jinping, where this has really shifted. So again, that's great. This could be kind of a cool intellectual construct that matters absolutely zero for actual stuff happening in China or in Chinese behavior in the world. So, like, why should we care about any of this intellectual construct? Well, it turns out it actually has really affected behavior, both domestically and externally. And the changes are often explicitly linked when they are announced or shortly after to the new concept, the comprehensive national security concept. So the Central National Security Commission now has counterparts down to the local level. So to kind of push national security thinking down to grassroots security officials. The changes to the PLA and the PAP, especially the PAP, were explicitly linked to, okay, the threat environment's changed, we have this new concept, we've got to reorganize the bureaucracy to deal with this. Xi Jinping has reorganized and consolidated the discipline and supervision apparatus and has talked about it as a sharp sword. So if the party's the gun, the political and legal apparatus, the sort of internal security apparatus, is often referred to as a knife. And he started referring to the discipline and supervision apparatus as a sharp sword. That doesn't seem to have really caught on. It's been kind of sporadic use, but it's kind of, you've got this sort of trinity of weapons that are really interesting. There's an entirely new legal architecture for national security laws that lay out the roles of these new actors in the bureaucratic changes that have made, that empower them particularly to address the connections between internal and external threats. Like the Hong Kong national security law does a lot of this. The national intelligence law does a lot of this. And then also lay out sort of the infrastructure and powers for this multidimensional information-based prevention and control system that the CCP Central Committee and State Council ordered to be established in 2014. So what that actually looks like is like a list of laws like this. I actually didn't give you both pages because it would just be painfully small on a PowerPoint slide, but there is a second page. It would go down to about here. It's not a full page, but it's close, probably another at least half a page. Of laws ranging from cybersecurity to defense transportation to, defense mobilization was one recent one that showed up in a piece in Foreign Affairs. Counterterrorism, criminal procedure law got changed to deal with how political dissent cases are handled. Like very wide-ranging, multi-piece changes to the legal architecture of national security in China. The budget really changed. So around 2012, 2013 is when the domestic security budget started to exceed the spending on the military and on external defense. So it was around the time that these changes were in process. And so you get, a real buildup of the surveillance state, largely funded at the provincial or sub-provincial level. Right, so external defense funding is mostly at the central level in China. Domestic security funding is funded by localities and provinces. But that's had a global impact, right? Because those companies, as they have, gotten procurement contracts, and then those contracts are kind of the market becomes a little more saturated domestically. A lot of those companies have then also sought to market their surveillance products overseas, and so this is a map of countries that have at least one city that's adopted like a safe cities, Huawei safe cities project, so not just the hardware, but also the back-end software to use it in policing and public security in at least one city in the country. I would love to do this on the municipal level. It's just been, the research design is fiendishly hard to get right, and there's too much missing data. But if anybody has ideas on how to make that map a little more accurate, it would be great, because the unit really should be cities, not countries, but it's been too hard to figure out how to do that well. On the personnel side, Xi Jinping has spent a lot of time and a lot of focus of the anti-corruption campaign purging the military and then the domestic security apparatus, and putting his people in place. A lot of that didn't really culminate until the 20th Party Congress, where he had a pretty clean sweep of appointments at the top levels, including the CMC and the domestic security apparatus. There was a rectification and education campaign for the last couple of years. It's really focused on internal security, but that follows a couple years where it was very intensively aimed at the military. So this guy, Sun Lijun, was a former vice minister of public security. He was accused of corruption, but also of this sort of building cabals and cliques to take over a key government department, right? This is political disloyalty. Again, who knows how much of this is true? This is and leaking confidential information. So it's really interesting. One of the things that came up in this case was that tech companies had shared information on sort of social media and tech activity by Chinese citizens. And with the national security law, you're like, okay, but the law authorizes the vice minister of public security to ask for this stuff. The suspicion is that maybe he was using it to keep track of other party members, which would be a no-no. That was the sort of rumor at the time, that it wasn't so much that he was doing it, but how and who he was getting data on that was the problem. But again, this follows the ouster of the two vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission in 2014, 2015. So at this point, the security apparatus, both military and domestic securities, had a pretty thorough house cleaning. And then finally, you have real policy changes and new policy developments that have come about as a result of this strategic concept. So Xinjiang, we now know from a lot of the documents that were leaked from Xinjiang that have been published by the New York Times and other places, that Xinjiang was kind of considered the first proving ground for this comprehensive national security concept. Xi Jinping announced the concept in April 2014. He goes to Xinjiang 2 weeks later. That visit doesn't go particularly well from a security standpoint. There are a couple of attacks. The CCP starts talking about changing its approach in Xinjiang. And that takes a couple of years, but it sort of culminates in a Central National Security Commission in Beijing in February and March of 2017. Chen Quanguo, the party secretary who'd been in Tibet, got moved up to Xinjiang, goes to Beijing, goes to this Central National Security Commission meeting, comes back, holds a series of rallies on sort of these big public plaza spaces in Xinjiang with the PAP and various sort of forces involved in counterterrorism. And the orders go out to dramatically expand this network of forced re-education and internment camps for Uyghurs that we've now read a lot about. So it's really the Central National Security Commission meeting really seems to, process-wise, have been tied to this escalation in collective repression in Xinjiang against the Uyghur minority. Which now 2 different U.S. administrations have legally determined meets the criteria for genocide. So it's had real policy consequences. And then the last piece is this, more recently, is the Global Security Initiative, which has been framed as an external extension or projection of the comprehensive national security concept. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that. Before I do, I just wanted to highlight sort of what happened in the 20th Party Congress, since we've been seeing that and the NPC. In the last couple of months, right? There was a lot of reporting about how newly prominent security was. National security had its own section for the first time, so it was pulled out into a standalone section in the work report. But it was interesting that a lot of the content of that was all the stuff that had been said in lower level forums and commentaries for a while. It was just that pieces of that got pulled out and elevated and codified at a very high level as doctrine. The former director of the Comprehensive National Security Commission office got moved up to the Politburo Standing Committee, so the very top echelon of China's leadership. And interestingly, there are a bunch of folks who got positions that used to be held by public security, the Ministry of Public Security, kind of the folks who do most everyday policing in China, both political and criminal policing. And a lot of those leadership positions that they had held got instead, Xi Jinping chose to put people in who had a background in state security, which is really an interesting choice, and probably tied to this perception that China needs to better integrate external and internal dimensions of security. I think there are also potentially some implications for Taiwan, because if you're worried in a Taiwan contingency about domestic security, having people who coordinate those two may be useful. Again, we can come back to those appointments if people have questions later. But the Global Security Initiative is something that Xi Jinping announced in April, so it's about a year old at this point. And it's described as the foreign policy dimension of the comprehensive national security concept. In some ways, what was puzzling about the comprehensive national security concept is that it didn't have a foreign policy dimension explicitly for a very long time. Because China is, in Chinese sort of thinking about and talking about threats in places like Hong Kong, in places like Xinjiang, there's a tendency to blame, we saw this in the zero COVID protests last November, there's a tendency to try to blame domestic unrest on black hands and external foreign forces who are destabilizing China via infiltration. And so in some ways, right, if you have a preventive concept and you're supposed to go get problems at their origin, and you believe that some of your domestic security problems have an external motivating force, you actually have to have an external way of proactively dealing with the source of those problems. So in some ways, the surprise is not that Xi Jinping announced a global security initiative, it's actually intellectually that it took so long. And so they talk, but if you look at places like Kicker, the think tank that's most closely affiliated with the Chinese Ministry of State Security, and that has a research center on the comprehensive national security concept, they published some of the first commentaries that describe the Global Security Initiative as a way of instantiating the comprehensive national security concept in China's diplomacy and foreign policy. Right, that it's a vertical continuation of the comprehensive national security concept into foreign policy, that it's a way to coordinate between domestic security and the common, what they call the common security of the world, right? But it's the comprehensive national security concept functioning as a guide to China's diplomatic work, right? Those are some of the ways that GSI is described. Lots of people have noted that even the choice of the word for initiative, right? I think Taylor, you've pointed this out, right? The word for initiative is actually kind of vaguer than like plan, right? Or sort of, so, you know, one of the things that happened when this came out is people were like, this is really vague. We have no idea, like, what does this actually mean? But the same thing happened with the comprehensive national security concept. It was kind of a slogan and a concept, and being like, we don't know what's new. China's always linked external and internal security. Like, how is this new and different? I don't think this is going to change anything. And then it had all of these systematic architectural effects. So if that's the precedent, I think we could be seeing something similar unfolding with the Global Security Initiative. It's too soon to tell, right? Based on what I'm reading, I think it's likely to become sort of a way of systematizing and organizing China's foreign policy to harmonize it with the comprehensive national security concept. So I do think it will be transformative, but in more of a way that it's systematic, and it provides the organizing principles and intellectual architecture for linking domestic and foreign security policy. So not all of it is going to be new. You're going to see existing policies repackaged and brought in under this umbrella, along with some new initiatives and some new behavior. And like I said, it's kind of a necessary but heretofore missing component of this preventive logic that Xi Jinping has been articulating for a while. The preventive logic, external and internal are linked, but we don't have an external way of dealing with these things that are causing internal problems, right? That never quite made sense. And so this actually fills in a sort of logical gap in the strategic concept. One of its aims is to revise global security governance. So primarily right now that seems to mean two things. One is the use of international law enforcement cooperation at a much more active, proactive level to address non-traditional, what the CCP calls non-traditional security challenges. And the other is a push for revision of regional security architecture, particularly in ways that sort of bypass or are not dependent on the United States. So for example, on the internationalization of law enforcement, around 2017, Xi Jinping started exhorting the Ministry of Public Security and other folks to adopt a global vision in state security work. You saw, these are all sort of senior level public security officials using this language of prevention and control with respect to overseas security risks, talking about building new systems of public security international cooperation work, usually led by the party. And this, again, this blurring of internal and external. So there's a great quote that basically says, overseas is not extrajudicial, and physically escaping does not provide you a way out. It's actually, I haven't found a smooth way to translate what is a very sort of like striking, concise Chinese phrasing. But it's really interesting because it basically says, it doesn't matter where physically you are not outside the body politic. And we will apply these tools and this approach, no matter where you are. So this is one of the big, it's now called the International Public Security Cooperation Forum, but it was called the Lianyungang Forum for a while. It's a police and law enforcement cooperation forum that China has organized. That's one of the sort of big institutional sort of convenings that China has initiated. Xi Jinping, under the GSI, has now made offers of police training to the SCO in Central Asia, to Southeast Asia. It was part of an offer to the Pacific Islands last year. The GSI concept paper that the PRC released talks about training 5,000 security professionals, is the phrase that they translate into English in the developing world. There's a pretty good report by Jordan Link at the Center for American Progress that goes through China's police diplomacy and how much that's expanded since 2012, in the last 10 years. And then the FBI has been warning for some time about what they perceive to be a concerning increase in transnational repression. I don't think we have great comparative data on that over time, but that's the trend that they've reported around the time that this other activity is taking place. If what you're seeing, right, the Ministry of Public Security doesn't draw a clean line between criminal and political policing, right? The same Ministry of Public Security offices and personnel sometimes do both functions. So if there's increased police activity abroad, even if it's not necessarily consciously intentional, you may get some increase in political policing because that's the way it functions internally. You project that abroad. You would have to make a conscious effort to change or to draw a distinction where one doesn't exist domestically. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is an increase, but I don't think we have very good data and measurement on this right now. It's one of the things I'm hoping to try to do in the course of finishing this book in the next year or so. But the other thing has to do with regional security architecture. And Ukraine has been like an incredibly sort of influential Chinese example in the rhetoric, including around GSI. But the joint statement actually has this really interesting line about Russia and China standing against attempts by external forces to undermine security and stability in their common adjacent regions, intend to counter outside interference in internal affairs, right? This is the Black Hands trying to destabilize the CCP or destabilize Putin's regime, right? Oppose color revolutions, same idea, foreign influence, destabilizing regimes, and will increase cooperation in the aforementioned areas. This language was new, right? It was not in previous joint statements between Moscow and Beijing, right? And it is really, again, primarily regime security focus, but the implication there has to do with regional security architecture. And so China has very much, even though it says Taiwan and Ukraine are different because one is a matter of succession and one is a matter of sovereignty, and Taiwan doesn't have that. So they're fundamentally different. But the United States is still the problem in both cases because it has this regional security architecture that's destabilizing, and NATO has been the sort of consistently the scapegoat in Chinese rhetoric about Ukraine. So there's this link between sort of criticisms of the role of NATO in Europe and the American security architecture, and GSI is framed as an alternative. It's an alternative where look, the United States network of alliances and partners fundamentally is zero-sum because it pursues security for people inside the US-led network at the expense of everybody else. It is destabilizing. China has this more inclusive alternative. And look, by the way, look, we have an example of what GSI can produce, right? And so the Iran-Saudi Arabia agreement was really, again, was framed as a success case for GSI. Look what GSI can produce as an alternative, right? And Wang Yi talked about it as a successful practice for strong implementation of the global security initiative. Look, if we just, bypass the United States, look what we can do. And again, this quote, which is from Xinhua, it's actually paraphrasing a Lebanese activist, so it's not authoritative or anything, but talks about the world being open to an order characterized by multilateralism, championed by China, as opposed to this exclusive security architecture that the United States has created. Okay, so I've talked for a long time. I want to stop and talk more about what your questions and feedback are. But I think that there are a couple of implications for policy here. One is that China's grand strategy takes regime security as the end and has this sort of preventive revisionism as the means. And it's preventive, I'm hesitating about the use of the word revisionism a little bit here, but it is preventive, and it's preventive to an extent that China does revisionist things in an effort to achieve those preventive aims. And that's true both domestically, right? When you look at Xinjiang, the immunization metaphor by definition means that you are targeting and intervening on people who show no symptoms, right? Maybe COVID puts an asterisk on this, but generally, like I have two kids, right? They're 6 and 8. You don't immunize them after they get measles, right? Or after they have symptoms of measles. You immunize them before. That's the point of the MMR, right? So the immunization metaphor means, by definition, you are targeting people who don't have the symptoms and don't have a political disease yet, right? And so it is hyper-preventive, but that means it, just as the logic of preemption or prevention can lead to offensive action, it can lead to you being the first mover. You see a lot of that showing up internally in Chinese behavior, and I think increasingly in China's behavior in the international system. This may mean that reassurance gets harder, right? So we talk about deterrence, and we talk about the sort of deterrence part, but the flip side of that is a reassurance component. Hey, we want to deter you from taking this action, but we're going to reassure you at the same time that if you don't take it, here's what you get to keep, or here's what you get out of that, right? But it's going to be really hard for any American administration, so we're talking about the US-China bilateral relationship, right, to say, hey, it's fine, we'll reassure you, you can stay in power, CCP, forever, and that's fine, and we'll reassure you about that as a way if you just don't do this or this, right? I can't politically see that it's feasible for an American administration of any party orientation to say anything like that explicitly, but if that's what would actually be reassuring and secure for the CCP, then it could potentially complicate the task of reassurance and that piece of the US-China bilateral relationship. The other thing is that if internal instability has these external dimensions and internal and external security are correlated, like are interlocked and mutually activated, right, you're not going to get retrenchment. And so sometimes, right, if you look at, I would say both the Obama and the Biden national security strategies, there's a little bit of an element of we're going to pull back a little bit and be more judicious in our involvement overseas in order to rebuild at home, right, build back better. Biden administration re-strengthen American democracy and institutions, right? There's a version of that if you look back at the Obama NSS as well, right? So there's a little bit of a trade-off, right? If we are more challenged at home, we might pull back or be less proactive overseas. if you believe that external dimensions are causing your internal instability, then you might escalate on both fronts simultaneously. And I think that logic is actually why you have maybe seen China be simultaneously more repressive and proactive about repression at home, while also being more assertive in certain ways abroad. The other thing here is that there are particular areas where that external-internal security nexus is particularly strong. That's true of geography, right? Hong Kong, Xinjiang are two places where China sees itself as sort of vulnerable to external permeation of destabilizing foreign forces. I don't think it's an accident that the comprehensive national security concept is escalated repression and control in both of those. But the other issue is that diaspora groups are places where that internal-external boundary is porous, right? Diaspora is one way of talking about them, is that they're outside the state but inside the people, or inside the body politic, physically outside the state but within the body politic. That means that I think diaspora politics are likely to be securitized. I just finished a Cambridge Elements book, so a short book on North Korea's diaspora politics. North Korea's diaspora politics are almost entirely securitized, and the diaspora is almost entirely a threat. China has tended, I think, to view its diaspora more in terms of economic opportunity and investment and as a resource. To the extent that those folks become a security threat, I think you're seeing a securitization of diaspora politics on the Chinese side, but then also on the United States side has looked at that and responded to things with policy programs like the China Initiative, which have not always been productive. And so I think this question of, at a policy level, of how to handle the likely securitization of diaspora policy is going to be a really tricky one for the United States and other liberal democracies to grapple with. And the sort of ongoing externalization of domestic security practices, I also think there are some potential implications for Taiwan. So one of the indicators that I haven't heard anyone talk about, but that I would be most worried about, is if you start seeing the national security language get applied to Taiwan. When Xinjiang and Hong Kong started getting discussed in terms of national security, that indicated a real shift in the CCP's sort of risk acceptance, its willingness to escalate repression, and its willingness to accept costs for achieving what it perceived as the necessary level of regime security. Haven't heard much of that with respect to Taiwan yet, but that's why the language of tumors and sort of medical metaphors is a little bit concerning, because if it is a precursor to that kind of language being applied, I think that could signal that the CCP is more concerned about and feels some need to intervene to quote unquote save the rest of the Chinese sort of political body by dealing with or intervening on Taiwan. And so I think that language probably bears pretty careful watching, because it could be an indicator and not a traditional military one. There's lots of debate over how much warning we would have on a potential Taiwan crisis or scenario emerging. I've heard well-informed analysts give different takes. One indicator I haven't seen, but that I think might be useful, is this kind of rhetoric, and whether or not Taiwan starts to get brought into this national security discourse in ways it hasn't been previously. So I'll stop there. Sorry I went a little bit long. I'm really interested to hear what all of your comments and questions are. Thank you.
Great. Perfect. Thanks, Sheena.
Should I turn this off and use that mic, or leave it on? Okay.
All right, so I've got Rich Nielsen in the back first, because I know he has to leave at some point soon. Everyone else, keep your hands up. But Rich, first question to you.
Thanks so much. This was very enlightening. On that last point that you brought up, you said that tumor quotes seemed like a one-off at the moment.
I gotta check that, so don't quote me on that yet.
It reminded me of Marika Landau-Wells's work, which I was on her committee, so I'm very familiar with, about dehumanizing language and how it indicates threat perception. I guess I had not fully priced in what if that language started getting used, would you anticipate a change by the CCP in how it would treat residents of Taiwan if it were to gain political control of the island? Does that signal a change? And does the political control like that we've seen in the Uyghur regions, would that potentially be on the table for Taiwan, where it's not just decapitating the top, it's like everyone needs to go through some kind of re-education?
Great questions. There's a couple of pieces. Do you want to collect questions, or do you want me? Okay.
We'll collect later.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So I really like Landau Wells's work, in part because I think it has a lot of applicability to China, because security is, in her framework, if I'm remembering it correctly, she talks about security not just as a matter of physical safety, but ideological contamination. And I think there's a lot of that applies to the Chinese case, particularly in Xinjiang, where the idea of a thought virus and political thinking that then had physical implications was, right, what is the tumor? It was in some ways more ideological. And the CCP actually, if you look at some of the think tank rhetoric, there's discussions about ideological security and early ideological warning mechanisms, and even the potential for there to be ideological security dilemmas between the United States and China. And I very much think actually that is what's happening, in that the CCP looks at the United States rhetoric of democracy, which we see as fundamentally defensive of and protective of democracy, and they see it as offensive and destabilizing toward China and toward the CCP. So I actually think that there's some real analytical utility to that. In terms of application to Taiwan, the work report this past fall, I think for the first time, Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, did not contain a provision and a promise not to station troops on Taiwan. Believe that was a change.
Wasn't the work report? It was the white paper.
It was a white paper, yeah.
But yes,
I'm sorry, yes.
It omitted that previous assurance.
So there had been a previous assurance: we will not militarize an occupation. It will be civilian. That's gone, right? And generally, Chinese policy discourse is formulaic and careful enough about wording that the omission of a previous phrase sometimes means something. And so I'd want to see maybe one more version of a white paper to see if to make sure that wasn't a one-off. But I think the absence of that is a signal. To the extent that there's some cooperation or lessons learned from Russia's occupation of Ukraine, I think it's maybe too soon to tell. But one of the things that I think is actually a really important question that I haven't had a chance to look at yet, but will probably be part of this project or some spin-off from it, is what, if any, contingency planning the PLA has done for the occupation of Taiwan, right? The kind of the day after, what they've learned from watching the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, if anything, what they might be learning from Russia in Ukraine. What do they consider comparable cases? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's actually a really important question to ask. And so I just started a research project that's looking at that. But I don't know that I have a good handle on what the Chinese discussion, how extensive it has been, or even what are considered analogous cases, to give you a sense of how that might play out.
Sounds like I'll check back in a year or two.
Hopefully more like 6 months, but okay. Sure, might be a year. Give me a year.
Thanks.
Great. So, Ken, I know you've got to leave pretty soon, so I'll turn to you now.
Okay, thanks very much. Great talk. So you went over the relationship between security and stability very effectively, completely convincing. You went over the disease metaphors and fears of contamination. And my question really is on the relationship between these emerging explicit areas of grand strategy, although not public grand strategy, and old areas of grand strategy in economics. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the 5-year plans, you look at Chinese economic strategy, it's been out there, it's been explicit, and it's been very externally oriented, internal and external, with fears or possibilities of contamination very much a part of it because of the interaction. That also goes for the diaspora, which has been an element of the economic and educational grand strategy as well. Mm-hmm. So the question that I have is looking to harmonization, the word that you used earlier, but harmonization of national security strategy with pre-existing explicit elements of economic and educational grand strategy. Are things changing on that side? You did mention, for example, the anti-foreign sanctions legislation. But are there
I can't remember if that was on page 1 or page 2 of that
early,
list.
okay.
Yeah.
But are there things going on in terms of revisions or adjustments on the economic and educational side by virtue of the emergence of the national security internal and external strategies they've described?
Yeah, so I think related to this, this potential inversion or change in the relationship between security and development is a willingness to bear higher economic cost or at least tolerate lower economic growth than we thought Chinese leaders were previously willing to accept in order to assure stability. And my read of the zero COVID decision making is that essentially that was the thought process, that the risks to stability were judged to be too high to do anything other than continue on the zero COVID path. What's kind of interesting then is the sort of sudden change or reversal of that, which appears to have caught all sorts of people in and outside China off guard. I think that may have to do more with the very highly personalized, increasingly personalized nature of decision making in the CCP. But I think overall, what we've seen is I'm not an economist, so I hesitate because my prism tends to be what is the national security logic of these economic policy changes, which means I might not sort of systematically check whether there's an economic logic to them. So with that caveat, I think some of what we've seen is a willingness to just accept lower economic productivity, lower costs, lower growth in areas where it's deemed important to regime stability. So, for example, the sort of regulation of the tech sector, which could really stifle innovation, the tightening political control at universities across China, right? These are things that generally we think maybe aren't great for innovation and economic growth, but that seem to be being done for reasons of sort of prioritization of stability.
Stability over alles.
Possibly.
Thanks very much.
I think too on the educational part, there's been a really active effort to bring, to recruit people back through various mechanisms. Xi Jinping has talked particularly about AI and tech talent as a sort of a really important national imperative, and so I think there is a sort of personnel and sort of human capital element of that is interesting and potentially kind of cuts against, right, then creating an environment that is not as conducive to innovation once people do return in either the private sector or or university research. And so I can't pretend that it's entirely coherent, but I do think a lot of the economic policy changes seem to be in the direction of prioritizing stability and being willing to bear higher, at least than previous, economic costs.
Thank you very much.
I know we don't like to compare or talk about Xi Jinping and Deng Xiaoping, but in 1989, right, Deng Xiaoping said stability above all else. So there are some eerie parallels. Even the context is totally different, right?
Yeah.
Renata.
Yes, thanks for this really interesting talk. And I guess I have just one question that kind of came out. So as you were talking about this problem that's fundamental to authoritarian grand strategy or to Chinese grand strategy, which is that of dealing with internal threats as sort of the primary threat to regime security, but also external threats. And so the way you're describing the approaches to both, it's preventive revisionism. I guess one question that I had just listening to all of the evidence that you presented was, in some ways these are presented as sort of complementary or mutually reinforcing approaches, but do you see evidence or are there historical parallels to draw on that suggest that these approaches might work at cross purposes? Right, so in some ways, like the Global Security Initiative, you talk about the internationalization of law enforcement seems to have benefits for the internal security problem. You can better police the diaspora, for example. But could we think of these approaches maybe working at cross purposes, like so in Xinjiang, for example, repression, you mentioned policy consequences, right, leading to exacerbation of or further straining of relations with the West, right? So that's maybe an example where it's working at odds. And so I guess just like to what extent are these approaches complementary, or do they actually create tensions or new problems for China to solve, which maybe then could be exploited from a U.S. national security thinking? I just would love to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one of the things that I think is to some extent puzzled external observers is that China doesn't seem all that receptive to whatever international costs it is accumulating to some of its more assertive policy decisions, whether that's in Xinjiang or some of its foreign policy pieces. The limited number of times I've been able to sort of try to talk to counterparts or Chinese analysts about Xinjiang in particular, hey, this seems like this is having some cost. Like, how do you, the sort of the official narrative in Xinjiang is that the policy's been successful. And so if you pose a kind of open-ended question, okay, how do you define success? Because it seems like this has had some real external costs in terms of sanctions, in terms of some global backlash, albeit, not universal. There are countries that have been supportive of China's policies in Xinjiang, right? These competing letters that get circulated at the UN every once in a while. And the metric that comes back is there haven't been any major attacks in 5 years or X years, right? I think now it's 6 or 7, right? And that's the metric we care about, right? So there's a very clear prioritization of an internal over an external metric. It's not that the awareness of a cost doesn't exist, it's just secondary to a different metric. And that's been pretty consistent, at least on Xinjiang. I think one of the questions, big unanswered questions about the Chinese political system right now is how receptive it is to negative feedback on anything, right? This is a pretty common issue with, authoritarian regimes. Most of us have probably seen that infamous scene in Downfall that gets parodied all the time, where Hitler's generals are trying to tell him that he can't do what he is ordering the Nazi war machine to do. And he kind of loses it, right? You look at Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it's like a textbook case of some of the pathologies of authoritarian, military management, right? Caitlin Talmadge's book on this, I think, is pretty superb. And so, one of the questions is, given the nature of decision and the structure of decision-making in China today, can anybody deliver negative feedback and have it alter the system? And I don't know that we know the answer to that. It seems like the answer might less and less often be yes, right? Or more and more often be no. So what kind of feedback the Chinese leadership and political system respond to is unclear, at least to me right now. I'd welcome other folks' thoughts on that. In terms of historical parallels, I don't know. I'm actually grappling a little bit in this book project with how much to make a broader argument about authoritarian grand strategy, and is this sort of fundamentally a claim about authoritarian grand strategy? Because the argument about prioritization of internal security would seem to potentially apply to a broader set of regimes than China. I have been so busy trying, and Xi Jinping keeps coming up with new parts of this whole concept that are a full-time job to keep track of. I'm having trouble getting the space to think and go back and look for comparative historical examples. But that's I'm on leave to try to finish the book in the fall and hoping to have a little bit of chance to answer that question, because I do think it might provide some really important clues to your question. I just don't think I can answer it well right now. Sorry.
Dr. Burdett.
Thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I'm curious to get more of your thoughts on whether this black hand concept, that there are kind of external actors behind this domestic dissent, domestic problems, how sincere that belief is versus how politically instrumental it is, that it's easier to blame other people for your problems, and it probably also delegitimizes the real domestic grievances as being kind of foreign agents. And it's reminded me a lot of the Soviets doing the exact same thing as one kind of comparison. So I'm curious, how would we know how sincere it is? And then are the policy implications actually different if it's 50-50 versus half the time they really think it, half the time they don't, or it's 80-20, most of the time they're just kind of lying about it to at least tell the boss, yeah, it's not our fault, it's foreign agents.
Yeah. This is probably not going to satisfy you, but I'm kind of agnostic on the answer to that question, because ultimately I don't know. It's hard for me to figure out how I would objectively or falsifiably test the level of sincerity of a very complicated policy ecosystem. So I guess the way that I think about it is, I do think it serves instrumental purposes in trying to delegitimate domestic grievance and domestic calls for policy change, right? So one of the sort of widely circulated clips during the zero COVID protests was that there had been some attempts to paint zero COVID as fomented by external actors and foreign forces, anti-China foreign forces, and you actually saw the protesters sort of explicitly respond to that, and they were like, "What foreign forces? Marx? Lenin? Like, those are the foreign forces I see in Chinese society today," and that's not what this is about. It was interesting how explicit a counter narrative there was. Again, isolated clips on the internet, probably not representative of protest discourse or state response. But that moment struck me as very interesting because it was the protesters, I think, seeing a need to counter that narrative of delegitimization. If you go back and look at Chinese analyses of the fall of the Soviet Union, which seemed to shape Xi Jinping and the party's thinking quite a bit, there was genuine worry about peaceful evolution, about the role of the Catholic Church as a transnational actor in toppling communism, of other, if you look at the Chinese rhetoric about color revolutions, about their concerns about the Arab Spring, there are other examples where they are clearly paying attention to what the mechanisms of foreign influence are. And if you look, for example, at Xinjiang, right, some of the concern was about apps and social media were that they were enabling foreign content, ideological content, to get into Xinjiang. And that some of the concern was about reverse diffusion, both ideologically, but also potentially of people who had the knowledge from Syria and other parts of the Middle East of how to potentially attack China more capably than the weird folks who were dissatisfied had been able to do. It is a little bit tricky to try to assess whether that's sincere, because I think there's you have to be really careful. Sincere implies a sort of legitimacy to the thinking that I think makes it unhelpful for policy discourse. So I think that the CCP really perceived real threats in Xinjiang, but I think the threat perception was really out of touch with objective reality. I think the nature of authoritarian systems has to do with misrepresenting, distorting, and exaggerating threats in systematic ways. And so sincerity doesn't, I get concerned about the language of sincerity because there's a normative implication to sincerity. Like, they really believe it, so therefore somehow does that justify what happened in Xinjiang? Like, no. So explanation versus justification, I think you get into kind of a slippery slope when you think about sincerity. I do think the perception of some of these threats is real in certain parts of the Chinese security apparatus and security thinking. But when you set up a system that gives you that sort of systematically gives you bad information, it's and leads to threat inflation or exaggeration. I guess and maybe this sounds like I'm splitting hairs on word choice. I think some of those threat perceptions are real, but they are divorced from reality, and that doesn't, to me, really let the people making those decisions off the hook from the consequences and the fact that they're responding. The language of the UN human rights rapporteurs was grossly disproportionate repression and violence, right? And so, in some ways, I don't know how helpful it is to think about sincerity in that context if it given the disproportionality of the response. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could frame it without sincerity and without normative implications, right? And I think that I think the answer to the first part of the question is you can't falsify it. And so I guess if you think that regardless the policy implications are the same, whether people are doing this instrumentally versus real threat perceptions, regardless of how well-founded, right? I guess that's like, if you can't falsify that, but there's no real difference in terms of the policy implications, then the inability to falsify probably matters less, I guess. But I don't know if that is the conclusion of the second part of the question.
I would want to think about that a little bit more. I mean, because the policy response depends on a set of normative and value judgments, not just sort of analytical conclusions. So I would, the answer I would be giving would be not just an analytical one. And I would want to think a little bit more about how to answer, are the policy prescriptions the same? Probably depends on who's prescribing the policy. I think you would get people who work on China policy who would say, no, if these are sincere, then you should go try to educate people about what the objective level of threat is and make them see that this is not objective. Because I think that the heightened or sort of disproportionate degree of threat perception stems largely from the functioning in the sort of internal hard-baked dynamics of the political system. I'm not sure that kind of, like, let's educate China on how it perceives threats, because we can convince them to see their national security threats differently than we do. I'm just not convinced that conversation is going to be productive. But again, that's a more, I think it depends a little bit on what you think not just on whether or not you think these are real beliefs, but whether they are alterable through various policy tools. And again, that's just a complex enough question. I'd want to think through it before I try to give you a definitive answer on the spot.
I'm going to start grouping questions now. So first pair will be right here, Dick and Eric. So I'm going to ask your questions, and I'll turn it back to you, Sheena.
Good, thank you. That was a terrific presentation. I learned a lot. And in particular, I appreciated how the implications for policy followed your presentation so closely. In particular, the one bullet point that pointed out that GSI may complicate the task of reassurance in bilateral relations. And in particular, that built off of and leveraged off the securitization of the diaspora point, which is, I mean, actually, I find it hard to imagine a hotter button topic than that potentially. It's sort of it's right out of the Saudi playbook in a way, right? So, so this question of extraterritorial reach and is very sensitive, and I'm wondering if the only response that you identified in the talk was that the FBI issued warnings. But I guess I'd like to push you a little bit on that and ask if both U.S. unilateral and U.S.-led or non-U.S.-led multilateral discourse has changed as a result of a recognition that China is actively securitizing its diaspora because its diaspora is large and global. And that has got to concern, it seems to me, policymakers everywhere. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what kind of pushback is possible and what kind of pushback has already occurred.
Great, so I'll second that. Fantastic talk, thank you very much. So the primacy of domestic security and regime security, that's longstanding, hasn't changed, but this new emphasis on immunization and this proactive approach has, or at least the extent of emphasis on that. I'm wondering where that leaves the idea of a pressure valve in sort of the Chinese approach to dissent and dissatisfaction, and whether whether we can read anything about that. It does seem like under Hu Jintao there were elaborate mechanisms for monitoring public opinion that went beyond just sort of preventing public opinion. And now we have this history under Xi Jinping, and I think an example of failure with the zero COVID policy. And the first sign you get of it is sort of an explosion. Maybe not the first sign we saw, but certainly Xi Jinping does not seem to have reacted to whatever signs he was seeing. So anyways, is there any discussion of this that's explicit? So where does that leave China?
Yeah, let me tackle that second question first. So I wrote a short piece for the Journal of Democracy on the zero COVID protests as a failure of this model of prevention and control. And if I was Xi Jinping, right, and I had invested the vast amount of money, attention, and resources into prevention and control that he has, and sort of tried to get the system to do that, to see multiple simultaneous points of failure in that model, with common grievances, common apparent knowledge of what was happening in some other places, sympathy between Han majority on the east and the Uyghurs in the west, which the CCP has really tried to prevent from happening. Right? So if you look at state media coverage, and I have experienced this in conversation with Chinese colleagues and friends, right? The portrayal of Xinjiang as a dangerous, unstable, unsafe place. That framing effort, I think, has been very strong. And there's a book by Phil Potter and Chen Wang that talks a little bit about the way state media has tried to frame this to the Han majority audience. But so I think one of the consequences of having a system that deters people from of a surveillance state, if you convince people that it is omniscient and all-seeing, one of the consequences is that they're deterred from doing things, and you may actually get higher levels of preference falsification, which means that the Chinese political system could actually be becoming potentially more vulnerable to the kind of cascade that you saw in zero COVID. Right? So ironically, this could backfire by heightening the level of preference falsification and making it harder for the regime to detect the true level of dissatisfaction in society. And I just think that's like a ironic consequence of kind of the nature of authoritarian surveillance and repression, that it could actually contain kind of the seeds of its own downfall. I don't know for sure that that's what will happen. Nobody knows. I don't think anybody knows, but I think that's a possibility would be kind of tragically fitting in some ways, or not tragic, but kind of ironically appropriate, I guess. So that's the sort of short answer about the lack of a pressure valve and what that could actually produce, in terms of the preference falsification detection. On the diaspora issue, yeah, I actually think this is going to be one of the hardest issues for liberal democracies to grapple with, because to the extent that and Xi Jinping will use this language, which Hu Jintao used some of, but Hu Jintao tended to specifically attach it to Taiwan. Xi Jinping has kind of generalized it a bit. All the sons and daughters of the Chinese nation have an obligation to work for national rejuvenation, is the language he's used. I think an unhelpful response to that is to treat members of the Chinese diaspora like they're all potential CCP agents, right? Which is a little bit of some of the rhetoric that we've seen in the United States and elsewhere. I think that's kind of exactly the wrong response. One of the things that I think it's important to be aware of, I've actually had some conversations with folks at the FBI about this. I know a number of other China scholars have as well, Maggie Lewis and some other folks, is to understand that domestically China uses what Chinese politics scholars call relational repression, right? Using people's social ties to try to demobilize them, by putting pressure not necessarily on somebody who's politically active themselves, but on the other people they care about. For a lot of us, that's a really different moral calculus, right? Like, I might be willing to take some risks for myself, but if somebody starts targeting my sister, my parents, my in-laws' parents, for somebody who's maybe their parents are here, but their in-laws are in China, right? There are lots of different permutations. I think it is really important to understand that the securitization of the diaspora, because it is an externalization of domestic security practices, puts people at heightened risk for repression and coercion. And right now, I mean, we've had this conversation at UT. I imagine I know there have been some conversations in terms of how MIT as an academic institution thinks about this. Right now, if a student came to me and said, I'm experiencing this, it's not clear what I could do to help. And it's not exactly clear what the university could do to help, or whether someone would then be comfortable going to law enforcement or other authorities, because that's not the way that the sort of dominant political discourse has framed this. I think it's important to understand that one of the major risks is that people become more likely targets of Chinese repression. And so I did a little bit of work with Roy Truex a couple years ago on academic experiences with repression in China. And one of the things we found is that scholars who were ethnically Chinese or who had family in China were often more likely to have been asked to cooperate with the authorities or pressured to cooperate or approached and pressured in some particular ways. That was a few years ago, and the delta wasn't that big. My guess is that if we tried to measure that again, it would have grown. And again, we were only looking at academics, not the general diaspora population. So I think understanding that, the elevated risk, rather than sort of framing it as purely as a sort of espionage threat is an important obligation in a liberal democracy. But I think it's very, very hard to get. It seems to be very hard to get that right. And Dan Slater and Ian Johnston and others have pointed out that the potential for U.S.-China conflict to be racialized in ways that had to have a really disturbing precedent in World War II, in the Pacific War. That there are identity differences there that could lead to more dehumanization, that I think as a liberal democracy, the US and other liberal democracies really need to start thinking, are overdue in thinking really carefully about what our obligations and policy responses are. And I just think that almost I don't know of a country right now that is where I think it should be in thinking through and formulating effective policy responses.
So our next group will have 3 people. We've got 3 minutes left. So short questions, please. Raymond, you get the first question at lunch since you are not. Well, you're off the list. So Jonathan Camerly, Diana Zhu, and Wright Smith. Over to you guys.
Hey, Sheena. So real quick, so perceived threat to regime leads to changing grand strategy, which makes me think, well, what are the causes of the perceived threat to regime? And then you give this really depressing dialectical that the better it gets for China, the more scared they become about the regime. And so I just want to think, well, what can I do about that? What are the other factors that affect this? Is this sort of a structural thing that's inevitable? How would you weight this dialectical against other both pro and good and bad influences on regime security?
Yeah.
Great. My question is a simple one. Again, thank you for the presentation. What level of analysis do you think the explanation is for your theoretical argument, which is the internalization of grand strategy, at least in the case of China? Do you think that it's the individual, like Xi personally drive this change, structural, systemic level, or state levels, regime type, bureaucracy, state, regime survivorship that drives this change recently?
Right.
I was wondering if there's this kind of explicit linkage of the internal and external security apparatus kind of goals carries over into the bureaucracies and how it might impact sort of bureaucratic relationships between internally focused agencies and externally focused entities.
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so why did the threat change? In China's case, I think and this gets to Diana's question as well, I think there's an interaction between Xi Jinping as a leader and the system that selected him. So I think, the party selected Xi Jinping to do certain things that they thought had not been done under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, right? So I think there was a sense that, right, but then it's not clear to me that people knew exactly how much Xi Jinping would consolidate power and what he would do with it. And I do think his individual threat perceptions seem to shape things. So one of the conclusions I drew from my first book is that individual leaders' threat perceptions really do seem to matter. And I don't know how in the way that I looked at that in my first book was to look at people's private papers and try to compare that with some of what they'd said publicly and try to figure out what their actual threat perceptions were. I don't know how you do that with Xi Jinping, because you would literally maybe have to put him in a therapist's office or interview him in a way that I don't know that we could ever do. So I do think the individual matters here. I don't think Xi Jinping came out of nowhere, right? He was chosen by the party to do certain things. I think he's kind of run away with that a little bit. So I think there's a little bit of interaction, and he's also then changed the political system, right? So he has personalized power more, and so that there's an interactive kind of reverse causality effect there that I think is hard to disentangle the system from the person running it, and the way the person running it can change the system itself, the domestic system itself. So I think there's probably a longer conversation about why the threat perception changed, but I'm mindful that we're out of time, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to pick it up again later. On the internal and external sort of bureaucratic coordination, the PRC still seems not good at this, right? And so I remember there was a piece that talked about was the sort of balloon episode, a failure of the Central National Security Commission, because wasn't it supposed to coordinate internal and external security? And so why didn't it do this coordinating stuff? And why didn't they realize that it would have this blowback effect? And the foreign ministry seemed out of the loop. And like, why wasn't the NSC doing its job? And again, I think that assumes a role for the NSC that is largely about coordinating. So I don't think that the foreign ministry sits on the Central National Security Commission because it's supposed to harmonize internal. I think it is supposed to harmonize internal and external, but in order to get the internal stuff right. So I think the foreign ministry is there to give input about when foreign developments could have domestic security impacts, not for the internal security people to formulate foreign policy. Right? I actually think the directional arrow goes the other way. So I think it doesn't do a lot of coordinating on the foreign policy side, except at when foreign policy has domestic implications, which is different than it having the purpose of coordinating foreign policy. And it doesn't seem to do that, and the system still seems to have a lot of problems with coordinating among various actors that collectively comprise and execute Chinese foreign security policy. Still doesn't seem to me like a coordinated or a coherent policymaking apparatus, which has been a problem well before Xi Jinping, and people kind of thought that the Central National Security Commission might resolve that. It just doesn't appear to have done so, because that's not what it was designed for. It was designed for a much more internal purpose. That's my read of it.
Wonderful.
I'll stop there.
Please join me in thanking Sheena for a terrific talk.
Those were great questions. Thank you.